They say the Old West was built on freedom, grit, and opportunity, but what most people forget is just how brutal it really was. This wasn't some movie set with clean shootouts and tidy endings. It was lawless land, harsh terrain, and survival at its most unforgiving. People didn't just move west for adventure, they did it because they had no other choice. And once they got there, they found out fast that the frontier didn't care about hopes or dreams. It was about endurance, luck, and learning how to stay alive in a place that gave you nothing for free. In this video, we're digging into 10 hard facts that show why the Old West wasn't made for the weak and why only the toughest made it through. Number 1, life expectancy was brutally short. The romanticized version of the Old West often overlooks a stark and harsh reality. People didn't live long, and survival was never guaranteed. The average life expectancy was barely around 40 years, but that number doesn't fully capture the situation. It includes many who died in infancy or early childhood, which was tragically common, so if someone reached adulthood, they might live longer, but not by much. The real challenge was staying alive in a world where nearly every environment was hostile, every accident could be fatal, and the lack of even basic health care made ordinary ailments incredibly dangerous. A minor cut could become infected and turn septic. Pneumonia, dysentery, and tuberculosis swept through communities with devastating speed. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines for most illnesses, and no reliable hospitals. What passed for medical treatment was often improvised or superstitious, with practices based on outdated theories like balancing bodily humors or bloodletting. Medical professionals were scarce, and their qualifications were even more questionable. In many frontier towns, a so-called doctor might have had little more than a handful of books and a set of crude instruments. People had to rely on folk remedies, homemade tinctures, or unqualified helpers. Some were treated by barbers or blacksmiths who handled surgeries in addition to their trade. Midwives handled childbirth, but when complications arose, options were limited. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death among women, and many infants didn't survive their first year. The environment itself was unforgiving. Work-related injuries were common, especially among ranchers, cowboys, railroad workers, and miners. Broken limbs, crushed fingers, or head trauma from falling tools or animals often led to permanent disability or death because there was simply no effective emergency response. And because many lived isolated from towns, getting help in time was often impossible. Violence only compounded these risks. While Hollywood dramatized shootouts, the truth is that death by gunfire or knife was still a real threat, especially in lawless or disputed regions. Armed disputes over land, cattle, or grudges were frequent, and sometimes even a drunken argument could escalate into deadly violence. Combined with poor nutrition, harsh winters, contaminated water, and the ever-present possibility of accidents or ambush, it's clear that making it past 30 was already a hard-won achievement. Death wasn't just expected, it was an everyday part of life. Families buried their own, often without a priest or proper burial ground. Cemeteries filled up quickly and unmarked graves were scattered across the plains. The Old West wasn't designed to support human life comfortably. It demanded constant physical endurance, resilience in the face of loss, and a level of toughness that went far beyond what most people today will ever experience. The struggle for survival wasn't dramatic, it was constant, and it wore people down year by year, day by day. Number 2, lawmen and outlaws were often the same guys. In the American Old West, the image of a clean-cut sheriff upholding law and order against ruthless bandits is more myth than fact. The truth is that the line between those enforcing the law and those breaking it was not only blurry, it was often entirely non-existent. Many of the most recognized lawmen of the era had pasts that would make modern background checks explode in red flags. Figures like Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, and Wild Bill Hickok weren't merely enforcers of justice. They were gamblers, saloon keepers, debtors, and at times, suspects themselves. These men operated in a world where morality was transactional, and the ability to maintain control mattered more than legal consistency or ethical clarity. Lawmen were frequently chosen not for their experience or honesty, but for their popularity, charisma, or sheer willingness to take violent risks. Sheriffs and marshals were usually elected or appointed by local governments that had limited oversight and even less infrastructure. That meant individuals with criminal histories, gang ties, or personal vendettas could find themselves with badges and full authority to use force. Once in power, they often enforced the law selectively, protecting their own business interests, targeting rivals, or accepting bribes in exchange for looking the other way. The scarcity of accountability mechanisms made this kind of corruption not only possible, but common. Some towns essentially became private fiefdoms, controlled by men with guns and influence. The presence of outlaw gangs didn't always mean resistance to the law. In some regions, the outlaws were the law. Entire counties were under the informal control of criminal enterprises operating under official titles. Deputies and marshals would often switch sides if the price or pressure was right. Dual identities were normalized to the point where a man could lead a posse on Monday and rob a stagecoach on Friday. Loyalty to justice took a backseat to survival, influence, and control of local economies. Even the mechanisms of law enforcement were makeshift and unstable. Jailhouses were easy to break out of, trials were rushed or biased, and there was no real federal system to oversee how law was practiced from one territory to the next. Many lawmen carried out summary executions or handed over suspects to vigilantes because maintaining order by any means necessary was the priority. The concept of due process was, at best, a suggestion. What mattered was who had the support of local citizens, or at least who scared them into silence. The legacy of these figures is complicated. Their reputations were often shaped by newspaper editors with agendas or exaggerated by dime novelists looking to sell sensational stories. The same man might be a hero in one town and a wanted criminal in another, depending on the politics, the rumors, or who won the last gunfight. This fluid moral ground made it nearly impossible to define good and evil in absolute terms. Instead, what emerged was a culture where roles could shift overnight, where alliances were fluid, and where power was everything. The Old West wasn't shaped by justice. It was shaped by whoever could hold a town together through charisma, fear, or sheer violence. The badge wasn't a guarantee of righteousness. Sometimes, it was just another tool for getting ahead in a chaotic, unpredictable world. Number 3, guns were everywhere. But duels were rare. The myth of the Old West is built around the image of two men squaring off in a dusty street, hands twitching at their hips as a crowd watches in silence. But this cinematic trope hardly matches historical reality. Firearms were indeed widespread, and nearly every adult male carried a weapon of some kind, whether it was a Colt single-action army revolver, a Winchester rifle, or a double-barrel shotgun. Guns were considered tools as much as weapons used for hunting, protection, or intimidating rivals. However, structured, honor-driven duels were not only uncommon, but often discouraged or outright banned by local ordinances. In fact, many frontier towns like Tombstone or Dodge City enforced strict gun control measures within town limits. Visitors were expected to surrender their firearms upon entry, and failure to do so could lead to arrest or fines. The aim wasn't to stop violence entirely. Lawmen knew that was unrealistic, but to prevent it from erupting in crowded public spaces where it could spiral out of control. Most of the gun violence in the Old West didn't come from dramatic face-offs. It came from ambushes, chaotic brawls, or spontaneous outbursts of anger. Shootings were often messy, unplanned, and driven by alcohol, gambling disputes, or personal grudges. Saloon fights that escalated into deadly confrontations were far more common than any theatrical duels. In many cases, the person who got shot never even had time to draw. Gunfights at night, sneak attacks in alleyways, and bushwhackings on remote roads were the norm. Violence wasn't romantic. It was tactical, reckless, and driven by fear or gain. Territorial feuds, cattle rustling, and disputes over water rights or land boundaries frequently led to armed conflicts, not just between individuals but sometimes entire families or factions. The Johnson County War in Wyoming, for example, wasn't a single shootout. It was a prolonged armed conflict involving hired gunmen, ranchers, and local settlers. Violence in the West often took the form of collective retaliation or economically motivated raids rather than formal challenges to personal honor. Even among lawmen, killings were more often a product of tactical necessity than the ceremonial duels portrayed in popular media. Another major factor was that firearms weren't always reliable or accurate, especially during the earlier decades of westward expansion. Guns misfired, jammed, or failed to hit anything unless fired at close range. This further discouraged any kind of structured duel, as there was no guarantee of a clean or decisive outcome. In a world where life was already unpredictable, people weren't looking for dramatic standoffs. They were looking to survive, often by shooting first or shooting from behind cover. Number 4, Native Americans lived under constant threat. The narrative of the Old West is incomplete without confronting the devastating impact of westward expansion on Native American communities. For centuries before European settlers arrived, these lands were home to complex tribal societies with their own systems of governance, trade, and culture. When the push for expansion began in earnest during the 19th century, Native Americans were seen as obstacles to progress rather than sovereign nations. The encroachment on their territories was backed by federal policies that systematically stripped them of land through manipulated treaties, many of which were either broken outright or signed under coercion. Resistance was met with military force and countless confrontations. Some officially called battles, many more remembered as massacres, left entire villages decimated. The threat was constant, not only from direct violence, but from environmental and systemic collapse. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, brought by settlers and soldiers, swept through populations with no immunity, killing more people than any battle. Meanwhile, forced relocation programs such as the Indian Removal Act and the establishment of reservations moved entire tribes from fertile ancestral lands to barren and unfamiliar territories. These areas lacked sustainable resources, and the promised governmental support in the form of rations, housing, and supplies was often insufficient, delayed, or never delivered at all. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, many native groups fought to retain their identity, autonomy, and connection to the land. Raids, skirmishes, and organized campaigns like those led by the Apache, Lakota, and Comanche showed that resistance was not only a response to violence but a form of cultural survival. Still, their efforts were gradually undermined by technological advantages, larger populations, and the political and economic weight of the United States government. Generations of trauma, broken families, and cultural erasure followed. What often gets lost in popular portrayals of the Old West is that for Native Americans, the era wasn't about opportunity or adventure. It was about survival under relentless assault, carried out by both official military campaigns and private settlers acting with impunity. Number 5, frontier justice was savage. In the absence of stable institutions, formal courts, or trustworthy law enforcement, many frontier communities in the Old West relied on a crude and often brutal form of self-regulation known as frontier justice. It wasn't guided by legal codes or rights-based frameworks. It was born out of desperation, isolation, and a deeply ingrained distrust of authority. When a crime occurred, or even when someone merely seemed suspicious, townspeople often formed vigilante groups that acted swiftly and without oversight. These groups weren't necessarily made up of villains or sadists. They were neighbors, merchants, ranchers, people with families who saw immediate punishment as the only way to maintain order. But that didn't make the process fair or rational. Once someone was accused, whether rightly or wrongly, they could find themselves imprisoned in a makeshift cell or tied to a tree before sundown. There was no time for evidence, no procedure for defense. A quick discussion in a saloon could end with a rope being thrown over a branch. In some regions, being an outsider was reason enough to be suspected. Accusations of theft, cattle rustling, or assault led to hangings with little to no verification. These acts weren't just spontaneous. They were organized expressions of fear and frustration in places where the state had little or no presence. Mob justice served a purpose, but it was more about exerting control and deterring further disruption than establishing truth or fairness. In practice, it meant that innocent people were often the ones who paid the price. Number 6. Cowboys worked insanely hard for almost nothing. The modern image of the cowboy as a rugged icon of independence and adventure doesn't align with the exhausting, poorly compensated life most of them actually lived. Cowboys were manual laborers performing some of the most grueling tasks on the frontier, and their daily reality was defined by relentless physical hardship, low pay, and a lack of security. A typical cattle drive meant riding for 12 to 18 hours a day across unforgiving terrain, often through harsh weather, sleeping on the ground with nothing but a blanket, and subsisting on basic rations like beans, bacon, and hardtack. Their job involved managing large herds over hundreds of miles, constantly exposed to the risk of stampedes, attacks by rustlers or wild animals, and injury from horses or livestock. The work required not just strength, but precision, stamina, and unshakable focus. Despite the level of skill and endurance involved, cowboys were paid poorly, usually between $25 and $40 per month, depending on the ranch or region. Most had no savings, no access to medical care, and no real prospects for advancement. A large proportion of these men were not white, either. Black cowboys, many of whom were formerly enslaved, made up a significant part of the workforce, as did Mexican vaqueros and Native Americans. Their contributions were largely erased from later myth-making, though their techniques and traditions shaped cowboy culture more than most realize. When a drive ended, cowboys would often spend their wages quickly in frontier towns, blowing it on alcohol, gambling, or temporary lodging, knowing they'd soon be on the road again. Few had families with them, and the isolation took a toll. Injuries could mean permanent disability, and there were no legal protections or benefits. The glamour of cowboy life was created decades later, but in novels and movies. In truth, it was a harsh existence with little reward, sustained by those who had few other options and a willingness to endure whatever the land and the job threw at them. Number 7. Towns could be gone in a year. The rapid expansion of the American frontier created a unique phenomenon. Boom towns that seemed to rise from the dust in weeks and vanish just as quickly. These towns were born out of opportunity. Gold strikes, silver discoveries, railroad construction, or cattle trails could bring hundreds or even thousands of people to a previously empty patch of land. Buildings went up fast, often with scrap wood or canvas, driven not by long-term planning but by the urgent need to house workers, merchants, gamblers, and opportunists. In a matter of months, a functioning town might include saloons, general stores, stables, and crude boarding houses, all built around a single economic engine. But these settlements were incredibly fragile. If a mine yielded less than expected, if a new rail line bypassed the town by even a few miles, or if the local water supply failed, the entire community could unravel almost overnight. There were no safety nets, no established institutions to keep people rooted once the money dried up. Prospectors moved on to the next rumor of riches, businesses closed, and families packed whatever they could carry and left. Law enforcement, already limited, disappeared with the tax base. Crime surged in the vacuum, with desperate holdouts turning to theft or violence before leaving or being driven out. Some of these towns never even completed formal incorporation before fading from the map. The remains of these vanished settlements, collapsed shacks, empty streets, and decaying foundations, can still be found scattered across western states, silent evidence of how unstable life was in that era. A person might gamble everything on a new start in a place that, within months, would no longer exist. The speed and scale of these shifts reveal just how unpredictable frontier life really was. It wasn't just about surviving harsh conditions or lawlessness, it was about risking everything in places that could disappear without warning. Number 8, women had to be tough or they didn't make it. The Old West was an environment so demanding that survival required relentless physical and emotional endurance, and for women, that pressure was amplified by rigid gender roles, constant risk, and a severe lack of institutional support. Contrary to the limited portrayals that cast them solely as homemakers or secondary characters, women in frontier communities carried immense responsibilities and endured immense hardship, often under conditions more perilous than their male counterparts. While some were indeed wives and mothers managing households, many others took on roles as business owners, landholders, healers, and in some cases, even armed defenders of their property and family. A significant number ran boarding houses not only as a means of survival, but as community hubs for travelers and laborers, providing both income and a form of social structure in towns otherwise marked by instability and transience. Women also filled gaps in the labor force left by men who were off fighting, prospecting, or engaged in seasonal work, managing entire farms or ranches, raising livestock, and overseeing crop production with little or no help. In settlements far from any form of legal protection or medical aid, they frequently had to deliver their own children, treat injuries, and respond to threats with weapons close at hand. Access to medical care was minimal, and pregnancy was as dangerous as any confrontation with outlaws. Widows, especially, had no safety net. Many found themselves defending land titles or dealing with legal systems that did not recognize their property rights. Work in saloons, brothels, or as traveling entertainers, though stigmatized later, often provided one of the few consistent ways women could earn cash. These women navigated constant risk from clients, employers, and law enforcement, yet they carved out space to exercise agency and earn a living in a brutal economy. Figures like Annie Oakley were exceptions in terms of visibility, but they symbolized a wider reality. Survival demanded skill, confidence, and a willingness to break traditional molds. Women on the frontier didn't have the luxury of weakness or passivity. They shaped the foundation of frontier society, often quietly, often without credit, but always with a kind of endurance that reveals just how raw and unrelenting that world really was. Number 9. Diseases were deadlier than any outlaw. While the image of the Old West often conjures scenes of gunfights and bandits, the true silent killer of the era was disease, relentless, invisible, and far more indiscriminate than any six-shooter. The combination of inadequate sanitation, crowded living conditions, poor nutrition, and a limited understanding of medical science created the perfect environment for illness to spread rapidly and with devastating effect. Basic hygiene was a luxury. Most frontier towns lacked sewage systems, and water sources were often contaminated by waste, livestock runoff, or upstream pollution. People bathed infrequently, not out of choice, but because access to clean water was minimal and soap was expensive. These conditions allowed bacterial and viral infections to spread unchecked. Diseases like cholera, smallpox, typhoid fever, and tuberculosis moved through communities with terrifying speed. Cholera outbreaks could kill within hours due to severe dehydration, and tuberculosis, known then as consumption, spread easily in cramped cabins or saloons. Influenza and pneumonia, especially during harsh winters, claimed countless lives. A simple wound or untreated infection could lead to sepsis and death. There were no antibiotics, and antiseptics were rarely used correctly or at all. Surgical tools weren't sterilized, and doctors, if they were available, often worked based on outdated or incorrect theories. Anesthesia was inconsistent. Whiskey or opium served as crude painkillers, and surgical procedures were done with brute force and speed rather than precision. Childbirth was particularly hazardous. Women faced enormous risks without trained medical assistance, especially during complications like breech births or hemorrhage. Infant mortality was high, and many children didn't survive past their 5th birthday. The communal nature of town life only worsened outbreaks. Once disease took hold in a population, it often moved through entire settlements before anyone could react. When epidemics hit, there were no quarantine systems, and few had the means to flee. Death wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was slow, painful, and painfully common. Germs, not guns, were the West's deadliest adversaries, claiming more lives than any outlaw ever could. Number 10, the West was built on grit and desperation. The American West did not attract the comfortable or the privileged. It attracted those who had little left to lose and needed to start over, no matter the cost. It was a region shaped less by opportunity than by necessity. People migrated westward because they were escaping something: economic ruin, social restrictions, legal trouble, or the aftermath of war. Land was cheap through government programs like the Homestead Act, but nothing about the promise was guaranteed. Claiming a plot didn't mean safety or success. It meant you were responsible for turning untouched, often unforgiving land into something livable, and you had to do it alone or with minimal help. There were no paved roads, no electricity, no clean water systems, and no consistent food supply. You built your home with your own hands, often from sod or scavenged wood, and then spent every season battling the elements to keep it standing. Weather conditions could erase entire harvests overnight. Drought, floods, blizzards, and wildfires weren't rare. They were regular obstacles. Locust swarms destroyed crops, and illness could sweep through livestock herds, wiping out any chance of income or sustenance. Bandits, hostile raids, or disputes with neighbors added another layer of danger. Survival wasn't a matter of planning. It was endurance under pressure. Most days weren't about building a dream but avoiding disaster. This applied to everyone. Lawmen constantly outnumbered and outgunned. Cattle drivers facing starvation and storm crossings, settlers working land that barely yielded food, women keeping households alive through sickness and scarcity. Even outlaws lived with constant uncertainty, always watching for betrayal or capture. The West wasn't romantic. It was unstable and exhausting, built by people who endured not because they were brave or bold, but because they didn't have another choice. Everything about life on the frontier pushed people to their physical and emotional limits. What made someone a success wasn't brilliance. It was the stubborn refusal to give up, even when the land, the law, and luck seemed aligned against them. That brutal, unfiltered reality is what carved the Old West into something lasting. It wasn't about glory. It was about surviving each day long enough to see the next.